Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Well, things are really heating up on Canada-U.S. trade relations again, as President Biden and Speaker Pelosi pursue a Build Back Better legislative package that advantages U.S.-built electric vehicles. We also saw a new U.S. duty on Canadian softwood lumber of almost 18%, prompting calls for Canadian retaliation. Here to help us understand from another perspective, perhaps, is John Faso. He is the former U.S. congressman from upstate New York. Welcome back to the program, John.
Tony, nice to be with you and your viewers.
Absolutely. And I'd love to just get a sense from your vantage point, obviously stateside, what you see. Is this the start of further trade difficulties between Canada and the U.S.?
Well, as you know, we've had trade fights on softwood lumber and dairy for many years. In fact, the softwood lumber controversy goes back to the early 1980s. In fact, the way they designate these disputes is in Roman numerals. I think we're up to U.S. Canada 5 or 6 on softwood lumber. And the issue here, I think, is you have it's a standard thing. You have U.S. producers alleging unfair subsidization for Canadian producers who are, by and large, producing that timber off of state-owned property.
Right.
Whereas in the United States, virtually all of this production is on privately held property. So the question is, you have two different models here, and how do you rectify those? I know that the U.S. just almost doubled the tariff on softwood lumber to 17.9%. And ironically, Tony, this is taking place at a time of unprecedented inflation, at least in the last 30 plus years in the United States. The producer price index went up on a year-to-year basis about 6.2%. And that, of course, is stoking fears of inflation. So at the very time when we have inflation and people are seeing it in the grocery store, they're seeing it at the gas pump and everywhere else, the U.S. is slapping these tariffs on lumber, which is going to inflate the cost of building a home. So here in the States, the home builders are very much against this tariff increase. And the lumber producers are, as you can imagine, they're for it.
Yeah, I know it does seem like, as they say, deja vu all over again, because you're quite right. We've been down this road before about stumpage fees and crown land versus private land. Is there anything new, or is it just the same old argument over again?
I think it's the same argument. Obviously we have dispute mechanisms to resolve dispute resolution mechanisms in the U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement. And as with dairy, where we have another in a series of disputes, I would hope that both sides in this argument, the U.S. and Canada, will expeditiously move forward with the dispute resolution mechanisms to try to resolve this, because it is not in the interest of U.S. consumers, certainly, to be paying more for lumber, which is a major ingredient in home building. And we're seeing a spike in those housing costs in the United States as well in the last couple of years in particular. The area I live in the United States, the Hudson Valley of New York State, we've just had enormous pressures on price for housing. There's a shortage of housing, and putting these tariffs on, which is going to inflate the cost of new construction, really does seem counterproductive for the American consumer who's in that housing market. So I think that the key for both our trade ministers is to try to expeditiously move forward with the dispute resolution to resolve this issue.
Yeah, it sounds like, just as you said, we've been down this road before, so maybe this is an opportunity just to use the normal ways to try to resolve these things now that the U.S. has taken a stand and everybody knows where they stand on it. There can be the usage of the dispute resolution mechanism. We've got about 15 seconds left. Is that what you see happening next then? It'll go to a dispute resolution?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I do. And I think that the larger issue for the US and Canada is the competition from China. And we have this in a whole range of areas. And so
Right.
we're much better off cooperating than we are fighting.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with John Faso. He is a former U.S. congressman from upstate New York. John, you probably observed, as I did, the three amigos discussions that took place in Washington between or among Mexico's Obrador and Justin Trudeau and, of course, President Biden. Do you think that summit made any difference on some of the outstanding issues?
I don't think so. I think that the President Biden, and I'm a Republican, so I'm naturally perhaps not inclined to agree with a lot of his policy agenda. But I was one of those when I was in Congress who was working across the aisle on a bipartisan basis to try to find constructive ways to move us forward. But I think the administration's position on energy in particular are extremely damaging. And so here you have the prospect where the administration is trying to greatly restrict any use of fossil fuels. He blocked the Keystone pipeline the first day he was in office. And incredibly to me that the administration has not done anything to intercede with Michigan over the Line 5 issue, which is extraordinarily important, not just for the upper Midwest consumer for gasoline, diesel, propane, aircraft fuel, but much of that Line 5 production winds up back in Ontario, into refineries in your country, and it's going to be extraordinarily difficult if Governor Whitmer of Michigan succeeds in her effort to shut this pipeline down. When Enbridge, the owner of the pipeline, has pledged to spend a couple of $2 billion to build a brand new tunnel under the Straits of Mackinac to safely transport these energy products through that waterway. I mean, we all want to make sure that we're not having undue hazards and risks in the transport of these products, because they can be very polluting when they spill. But shutting down Line 5 would be a catastrophe for not just Canada, but for the United States. And at a time when here the energy prices have spiked, many people in this part of upstate New York, for instance, use home heating oil or propane to heat their homes. The temperature is really dipping down now, and it's getting cold. And so people are using fossil fuels. We are not going to, on a dime, switch to an electrified economy with renewable resources. And so there are going to be extreme price pressures that are being placed on consumers now. And so at the time when the Biden administration is taking these measures, they're also now going hat in hand to OPEC and Russia, asking them to boost their production of oil and natural gas, et cetera. So it just simply makes no sense. And I think on energy, there's a real, the Biden administration policies are highly counterproductive, and they're damaging to our U.S.-Canada relationship. And many of the pieces, the Buy America pieces that are in the Build Back Better program, which I think is very, very doubtful that's going to pass this year, if it passes at all. But there are pieces in there that are definitely discriminatory against our friendly neighbor to the north. And so this gets back to the larger point, which we should discuss, which is China.
Yes. And I do want to talk to you about that. I do want to ask you, though, just to unpack a little bit about the pressures on the U.S. Congress. You've been there yourself. What sort of pressure is there to pass a Build Back Better piece of legislation, which incidentally, for our viewers, has what Canadians would consider discriminatory practices to advance electric vehicle production in the U.S. At the expense of Canada and Mexico. So is that pressure building to a point at which they're going to be deciding something? You say no.
Well, I think there is going to be a decision. I hope that the Congress decides not to move forward. Now, they passed a version of it in the House of Representatives. The problem here is that for the Democrats is that they have a very narrow margin in the House. Not a single Republican voted for it in the House of Representatives. One Democrat from Maine voted against it. They have a 50-50 U.S. Senate, so they rely upon the Vice President, Kamala Harris, to break a tie. The problem they have is that Joe Manchin, a senator from energy-producing state West Virginia, has made it plain that he does not support Build Back Better and many components of it, not just on energy, but on other social welfare programs, he does not support.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with former U.S. Congressman John Faso. John, I had to interrupt you there. We were just going to a break, but please continue your thought about Senator Manchin. I guess Senator Sinema, too. They've got two Democratic senators who are a little bit not convinced that the Build Back Better legislation should pass.
Right. And truth be told, I think there are probably 3 or 4 Democrats that are kind of taking refuge behind Senators Manchin and Sinema, who have concerns about the bill, but are afraid of, frankly, being out front to express those concerns. I mean, we're in a very polarized time in the United States. It's very divided politically. And I think the basic Republican objection to the Build Back Better is that we have an extraordinary amount, literally over $6 or $7 trillion that has already been appropriated since the onset of COVID. Mm-hmm. The president wants to add what he calls 1.75 trillion more over the next 10 years, greatly expanding our deficits. But the problem is that they're not honestly accounting how that 1.75 trillion is put together, because many of the programs they're assuming are going to expire within a year or two, when everyone knows that once you start new social welfare spending, it's very hard ever to turn off that spigot.
Right.
So properly accounted, the 1.75 trillion is more like $4.5 trillion.
Wow.
And that is an extraordinary amount of money. Now, if the U.S. is already running multi-trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see, we have major problems with financing our Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid systems. Interest on the debt is over $400 billion a year. We expect interest rates to rise somewhat in 2022, and that's going to make the cost of carrying that debt higher. And what happens if we have an international incident, if we have another tremendous spike in COVID? All of these things, these unpredictable things, which are actually real possibilities. If we have an international incident in the Taiwan Strait, any number of things could call upon the federal government to spend more money for defense or for other emergencies. And so the Republican problem with this is that it's leaving us extremely vulnerable if we have other situations that we have to deal with. Now, Democrats will say, look, we need to expand childcare so that people can get back in the workforce. We need to have expansions of our health insurance system, et cetera. And there's no discounting the fact that there are real human needs out there. The question is, what can you afford? It's just like in your household budget. You have things you absolutely must spend on, and then you have things you hope and wish you could spend on. Well, right now, I think the Democrats are pushing a lot of wishful thinking in terms of spending at a very precarious time financially for the country. So I'm not sure. I don't believe we can afford what President Biden is talking about. So I think he would be fortunate if Senator Manchin and others actually block this plan from proceeding. I do not expect it to pass by Christmas, as Senator Schumer, the majority leader from my state, said yesterday. I do not expect that to happen. And I think we're into 2022. And the longer this hangs out there, the tougher it's going to be for them to actually pass it.
Because, of course, next year is an election year, so you got all those added political pressures on top of that. And there is a theory that Senator Schumer doesn't want it to pass either. So but we'll let the internal politics play out. We've got about a minute left, but in this segment, do want to talk. You mentioned China. I'm going to weave that into the electric vehicles controversy in Build Back Better, which talks about this major tax credit for electric vehicle production in the US of A. But the ultimate thing that is going on is, the US wants to bring back and make sure that they have green energy industry in the US, not in China. Is that part of the issue?
Well, that's part of it, certainly. There are provisions in there, though, that give preference for vehicles, for instance, that are built in the United States. And they also have a preference in that proposal for vehicles that are built in a union factory,
right,
as opposed to a non-union factory. And most of the foreign automakers, like Hyundai and Toyota, that have built facilities in the United States, they're located in so-called right-to-work states, generally in the South, where they do not have a mandatory union labor law.
And welcome back to Boom and Bust as we discuss Canada-U.S. trade relations with John Faso. He's a former U.S. congressman from upstate New York. John, we were just getting into electric vehicle production, those kinds of issues. Please continue.
Well, I mean, I think that as we're looking at how do we do this transition to a more renewable energy economy, we've got to recognize that in the 1970s and early 80s, we were all held hostage to the actions of OPEC on energy.
Right.
And in the last 10 years, the United States and certainly Canada have really been able to boost their production of natural gas and petroleum. And this has made the U.S. the largest producer of natural gas and petroleum in the world. So we're no longer held hostage by OPEC, and we're now exporting natural gas through LNG terminals, et cetera, around the world. And yet, if we go to 100% renewable and get rid of fossil fuels, my concern is that we're going to be trading ourselves back in a situation where we have dependency upon China, because where do they reprocess 80% of the rare earth metals and other materials that are necessary for high-tech products, for wind energy turbines, for solar energy rooftop systems, for other renewable energy products? 80% of those minerals are reprocessed in China.
Right.
This is a country that has shown itself to be very willing to use its economic leverage to extract political concessions. And if you look at what Xi Jinping has been doing in China, he's now made himself, in essence, president for life. And their system is entirely different from those of democracies like the US and Canada, where you have individual rights and religious freedom, personal liberties, et cetera. It's a very, very different world that we would be operating under if we allowed China to become the dominant player economically, politically, militarily in the world. I very much am concerned that we are rushing headlong into renewables that is going to create, before we're ready, create a dependency upon China for much of that renewable energy. I think that's a grave mistake. We need to enhance our production of minerals and reprocessing of these materials in North America. And that's why these fights that we're having over things like dairy and softwood lumber and the Buy America provisions are extremely counterproductive. We should be looking at this as how do we, as democracies, unite on our economic interests to foster our political and global interests as well?
Is that starting to happen in Washington? And I guess my last question, because we've got about a minute 20 left here, but what advice would you give to Canadian politicians if they want to have an impact on these questions on Capitol Hill?
I think I would very much encourage members of Parliament, regardless of their political stripe, to come to Washington, interact with members of Congress and others in the media to advance this point of view, because we need to look at certainly Canada and the United States, and to some extent Mexico, but particularly Canada and the United States, because we're so similar in our democratic values. We need to look upon the US and Canada as united on these questions. And sure, we'll have our certain squabbles from time to time, but we really need to look at the big picture, which is we're much stronger vis-a-vis China if we are united as the US and Canada.
Do you think, we got about 30 seconds left, do you think that's starting to be the point of view that is shared by many people in Congress?
I think, frankly, many people have their heads in the sand in Congress on both sides of the aisle on this topic. And I think we really need to step up the energy of our engagement. For those of us that are concerned about our future in this world and promoting democracy and free enterprise around the world, I think it's really incumbent upon us to step forward.
John Faso, it's always been a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tony.
Some great insights there by former U.S. Congressman John Faso on Canada-U.S. trade relations, what's going on Capitol Hill, and I guess some of the challenges that we face as a nation to get the interest and the attention of policymakers in Congress and in the executive branch. Never easy, but we've got to keep at it, not only for Canada's interests, but for world interests as well. Thanks for watching.